In this discussion, we'll be talking about episode 106, Stoke the Fire of the Body for Optimal Vitality. As usual, we'd like to start with the inspiration for this title.
Everything that I'm doing right now in metabolic regulation, metabolism, people call me with weight loss issues, depression, and it's all related to stoking the fire of the body. Everybody wants to talk about meditation and the mind, but we have a body and our body and mind are one. So if we work with the body first, moving forward, we want to have that fire. Remember, fire, the concept of fire is to change something, correct? When we eat, for example, or we put something on our fireplace, we put wood on a fire and it burns, it goes to ash, but it gives us heat and light. Well, the fire in the body works the same exact way. So when we stoke that fire of the body, we become vital, we become radiant, and we have the energy that we need. It's an ancient Ayurvedic concept. I didn't make this up. The title we used years ago. Remember when we did Feed Your Fire series? We had Stoke the Fire of the Body, Ignite the Fire of the Mind, and then
Right, right.
Awaken the Fire of the Spirit. So it all comes. Remember, the Ayurvedic concept of fire, Agni, is critically important to our overall health. It is, there's nothing, nobody would disclaim that because the Agni that we're talking about, that fire, is the force of our intelligence, and it occurs within each cell, tissue, and every system within the body, as well as the mind, actually.
I really like the intelligence of every cell. When you said that and I heard it in the podcast, it really resonated with me.
Well, yeah, because when we lose our intelligence, intelligence is applied awareness. So when we lose that, that's how disease comes in. That's how we get diseased. That's how inflammation happens. Inflammation is fire that's lost its intelligence of where it should be placed. And it goes crazy. It gets all over the place, and we become inflamed, and then we create disease. So again, it has to be balanced. And
Right.
that's
So,
just what
so
I
maybe you could talk about good Agni versus impaired Agni, or like how do you see the two?
Okay, if we look at impaired Agni is actually, I said just now, when we don't have that correct fire, that, let's look in the physical body. When our digestive juices, which are fiery, right? They're hot. When they're not operating functionally, what happens? We get indigestion, we get all sorts of digestive diseases. That's called impaired Agni. I'm trying to stay as simplistic, not because the audience is simplistic, but so that we can get a better picture of it. So when we don't have our food digested correctly, we lack nutrients, right? We can't absorb the nutrients because digestion is assimilation and a utilization of nutrients, and you need fire to have that happen, because fire brings physical into it, changes matter into energy, right? The food we eat is physical matter, and it gives us energy for our cells. And in the mind, it transforms will into action. So impaired Agni is the root of all imbalances, imbalance and disease. And we should really look at what are those signs. Then the easiest way to look at those signs is to look at our digestive functioning.
Okay.
And, for example, let's say you wake up and your stomach doesn't feel just right. You're a little nauseous. And you think, well, I ate
Sure.
late. I ate out last night, but it was late, and I ate out. I didn't eat my own food. Or maybe it's the bug that's going around the office.
Or ate too
And
much.
yeah, or
Or
maybe you ate too
too
much.
much of the wrong thing.
Now what do you do? Well, lunchtime comes up, right? And you kind of forget how you felt in the morning. You still have a little bit of the issue, but well, your friends are going out to lunch, and you say, I'm going to go out. I'm just going to have a bite to eat. But that bite to eat that you choose is not something that's going to re-enkindle the digestive function. It's going to actually put more wet wood, as I say, on fire. But you do it anyway. And, how many people do that? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, most people do it. They don't give their body time to digest. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, it was something that intuitively I just didn't feel like eating dinner. I just didn't feel like it. And yet I felt like having a salad. And I usually don't eat salads because in the wintertime when it's cold, my body doesn't need any more cold. I like to stick with warm foods, a cooked vegetable, for example. But the higher intelligence, it was just, you know what? Have some salad with a little bit of lemon and olive oil. And I did that. And during the night, I felt like I was getting a sore throat, for example. I was getting diseased. I was getting a sickness, or the sickness was already in the body. Now, if I ate a heavy meal, I would have woken up fully ill and I wouldn't have been able to record today with you and do the things that we're doing now. But I woke up, I jumped out of bed, I felt refreshed. And when I did some contemplation on really what was going on, my body was getting ill. It was breaking down. There was something that had caught during the week because I was feeling a little tired and sluggish during the week. So I said, oh, what could possibly be happening? But at the same time I was feeling tired, George, I also had the craving to eat double chocolate chip cookies that were homemade. But I didn't do it. I said, okay, I had to say, okay, mind, you can go do it, but I'm going to stay here and I'm not doing it. And I'm so grateful that I've done that because I would have actually added fuel to the fire, but have put out the fire and I would have gotten very ill. So what I'm trying to say here is when you're that in tune with your digestive function and know what it's capable of doing and not doing, you really tread with awareness. You use your intelligence, your applied awareness to not fall prey to what the temptation of taste and it wants you to do at that time. And that's just the point that I want to make here. You don't want to ignore the subtle, subtle signs. Sometimes they're not so subtle. You really feel ill. But if you could catch it at the subtle level, when you're just starting to feel a little bit of a change, you could probably turn around most illness.
Right.
You could
And
turn
the
it.
focus here is obviously digestive function. So the signs, as you call them, are really symptoms of the imbalance that you're talking about.
Correct. When we have something, when we get the onslaught of, let's say, if we're on a bus or a train or you're in an office and people, people still go to the office sneezing and coughing in their hands, they touch doorknobs. They don't think about people, what they're doing because they just don't know. They're doing their best, but they really don't know what they're doing in the sense of passing a virus or a bacteria around. And so you have to be able to protect yourself in that environment. And you can do that by just paying attention to your diet, those subtle aspects. Of course, washing your hands and, as we always do, washing our nose and our eyes and things like that. But you could always just pay attention.
Right. I know one of the things that helped me, it was probably a decade or so ago when I realized that grazing wasn't good and you shouldn't be eating all the time because you don't give your digestive function a break.
Right.
If it's always doing something, then, it's hard to know when it's
Right.
imbalanced.
Well, because 60% of your immune function is in your gut, actually, 60 to 70% of your lymphoid tissue is actually in your gut. And if you give it that time, it'll take care of most things for you.
You talked about how this imbalance is the cause of most health issues.
Well, I talk about most health issues begin at the level of energy.
Right.
So that's really what we're working with. We talk about prana or ki or chi. It's what martial arts will do, using that energy field. Or when we do yoga postures, we work with the pranic fields. It depends what language you're really using. But we could see those symptoms. That's exactly what we were just talking about. The subtle, subtle symptoms like indigestion or a little bit of lower back pain just shows us, hey, there's a little bit of a disturbance in our energy fields and the fire's either diminishing or beginning to blaze. They go two extremes, right? It could either diminish or it starts to blaze. I'm saying braze. You know, uh, People have said, I've heard it in Western medical, that many disease states start maybe, I've heard them say breast cancer even starts 8 years before it's physically detectable. That's amazing. And that would be a hard detection, of course. But there is there's something that occurs before a tumor is detected. We get the signals and we just have to really find out what those symptoms really are and how they really work. So, because we want to root up the cause, right? I always say root up the cause and restore function.
Maybe you could briefly talk about the extremes on the uh, too much fire side, balanced and not enough fire. Like, what does that feel like? What things do you look out for, the signs, as you call them?
Okay, so if we could look at the warning signs that let's look at it where it's not operating in full strength.
Okay.
We look at emotional disturbances. People tend to feel more fearful, anxious, where if the fire is maybe blazing too much, you'd have anger. So you're talking, are we more irritated in anger, which is blazing too much, or blazing in inappropriate areas, or let's just talk about we're not operating in the proper balance, and you can get any of those emotional disturbances. You also get low energy, weakness, or fatigue. You get an overactive appetite, for example, or a suppressed. They both work both ways. You get indigestion. Gas is the biggest one, bloating, constipation, hyperacid stomach, just feeling tired or mentally foggy after meals, which I've mentioned many times before. We don't have enough fire to move the food and to digest it and bring the matter into energy. Or, we have a tendency towards congestion in the sinuses, lymphatics, even congestion, George, in our minds. Are we holding on and churning that same thought over and over and over again? Or, gee, I have to go out and mow the lawn. I have to go out and mow the lawn. I don't ever do that because I absolutely love, by the way, mowing lawns. But there are other things maybe that I don't want to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're the kind of they're the warning signs when we have those fluctuations in our moods. Just watch how you feel and in your mood, and it always displays itself in a physical. As I say, uh, as an energy timeline for our diseases to set in.
Okay. That's a pretty good spectrum, I think. Thank you for that. So once you've identified the signals or signs, then you talk about rooting up the cause.
Well, we want to root up the cause because it's much easier to treat something in the early stages. I think I pointed out a couple of steps, if I recall, in the podcast that, you know, your vital force is in balance and harmony, you feel well, and you're really not aware of any discomfort. So you're okay, things are going along. And then, as I said, our vital force, our energy flow gets a little disrupted due to a habit that doesn't support our health, for example. You might start to feel vague discomfort in our GI. You might eat, get a little gassy, or gee, something's not digesting right. Or, I had mentioned, a digestive disturbance as I described above. But, I've had people call me and say they have a metallic taste in their mouth or they feel nauseous in the morning. These are all signs. Taste with the tongue is very, very important to diagnose. In Western medicine, they don't use the tongue to diagnose, but in Eastern, they do, even in traditional Chinese medicine as well as Ayurveda, just like pulse diagnosis, things like that. They're much more sensitive. In our culture, people aren't even touching a patient anymore. They're doing everything on computer. There is something to being able to look at a tongue and doing a pulse. And you can, when those are off just even a little bit, that's when you can start to really work with your diet and see, well, what really happened. But most of us self-medicate at that point, which is fine, but we kind of ignore it, it's going to go away. But it doesn't go away. And
Right.
then we say, okay, it's gone on for now a couple of weeks. And that's where we start showing signs of energy dysfunction at the organ level. We're not, they've become more prominent and uncomfortable. At this point, there's no tests because the test really can't detect anything because it's at an energetic level. I mean,
Right.
my primary care is my acupuncturist that I use. He's my primary care physician. Doesn't mean I wouldn't go to a primary care. I do go to a dentist, a regular dentist, and I go to primary care. But when I'm first at that energetic level, I go right to the acupuncturist because I need that energy field to be reestablished. And that's the step three. And then we go on to it becomes a real physical problem with a digestive disease. And that's where it becomes a physical health issue. And you can use the acupuncturist or the traditional Chinese medicine physician, but then at that time, you might also need some Western approach because Western does do wonderful things with acute illness in the point, or chronic where it's really taken hold, but you also need to combine that. That's why we have integrative and complementary care now, not integrative and alternative care, because it's not an alternative anymore. It's really an integrative complementary care because you really need both. And I talk about that in Feeling Good Matters, the yoga of mind, medicine, and healing. So it's important to know that those disease does come in steps. It's not all of a sudden a full-blown disease. Most people will say, "Well, I did get some symptoms early on, and I just ignored it." Now, we could keep ignoring it week after week after week, and then you have to go to the chiropractor, right? Or you go to the acupuncturist, or you go to an orthopedic, and then I remember I spent so much time. I had an injury where I was mountain biking, and my shoulders were rounded and my clavicle here. I went to an orthopedic because I literally couldn't move my shoulder. And he said, "Look, you're over 50. On old ladies, just wait. We saw off the bone so it doesn't protrude." I was like horrified.
Oh my
An
God.
orthopedic surgeon saying that. Well, surgery does surgery, I suppose. And over the years, I started studying enough to move. This is years ago. And it had to be, maybe I was in my late 40s at that time. And so I started moving my shoulder, doing the work that I do, and I applied it. I paid attention, and the bone went back. I didn't have somebody saw off the bone because it was protruding. So my point is things start at an energetic. When it gets to the gross form, when the bone is protruding, then you have to, that's why I went to a Western medical doctor. And but then I also went into acupuncture and said I'm going to work with that, and also my own movement therapy that I do as a yoga therapist. So, and it worked. It took 5 years. It wasn't just quick, soft the bone because you don't like what a bone looks like. I mean, that's extreme, but really that's what I got. So each step along the way, as I mentioned, just in summary, you'll get the discomfort, then the disruption starts in the energy channels. Your internal organs will start getting functional. You'll see whether you're constipated, your bowels will usually change, and then it becomes a physical problem. Or your gait changes in the case, let's say, of a back or a shoulder issue. Your lower back will start to show some signs. And there's always a purpose of that. And of course, there's a purpose. I used to say to look at a health issue, you get into crisis, to look at what is twice. CRISIS. We look at the two words, is. We have to look at it twice because we get the warning, right? And then
Sure.
we don't do anything about it, or we do. But if we don't, we get the crisis and then we look at it. And so some of the exercises that we need to know in order to really reestablishing, we're talking about here, reestablishing equilibrium. We're reestablishing our digestive fire so that we can have optimal vitality. We want to learn, if you're not already doing it, diaphragmatic breathing. And then once we establish diaphragmatic breathing, that means we're accessing our whole parasympathetic nervous system and we're regulating our sympathetic nervous system because the diaphragm is a dome muscle, as you've heard me say, that actually, when used in breathing, will keep us into a relaxed state of being. And then after that, we can do, I know you always like to talk about the 2-to-1 breathing because that relaxes you the most. We want to learn, after we learn diaphragmatic breathing, 2-to-1 just means we exhale for longer than we inhale. And it's really, really a wonderful practice because it will bring you into a deep state of relaxation. And remember, if we don't relax, we could never be disease free.
Gotcha. So I try to always do diaphragmatic breathing, so I guess that's why I don't really associate it when I do 2-to-1. I'm still
Right.
pulling it down, diaphragmatically.
Well, because you've done diaphragmatic breathing for 20 years, we've
Gotcha.
talked about this for 20 years.
It's a
But
habit.
yeah, you don't want to do 2-to-1 when you're chest breathing because you're still breathing from up here. But once the way it works is you've established diaphragmatic breathing, then you have even, smooth, steady with no pause between breaths at 1-to-1 breathing. Then 2-to-1 breathing is more advanced.
I
But we
see.
could start with that. We want to exhale longer. And then what that does is it elicits the parasympathetic response, which means rest and relax. the possum response. If you ever seen a little possum walk across a road, they're just wonderful little creatures, and they take their time. They're very relaxed.
Okay, so if you're just starting out, practice diaphragmatic breathing first, get that right, and then move on to
Right. And
meditation.
that'll actually regulate the entire nervous system, both the parasympathetic and sympathetic branch, which is our autonomic nervous system, which is tied to all our organ systems, and that will actually get the balance of that flow of energy going. That's the first start. Then you can work with your digestive system.